The Devil's Tree in Port St. Lucie has a dark history. Legend says in 1974, 2 young women were picked up while hitchhiking. A man took them to a spot in the woods beneath an old oak tree where he tied up the 19-year-olds and took his time violating and mutilating them. He eventually hung the women from the branches of the trees until they were dead, then buried them in shallow graves. For months, he would return to the tree, dig up the women, and continue to violate their bodies. 3 years later, in 1977, a few fishermen found some bones scattered beneath a tree near Canal 24 and 2 nooses swinging from a branch. Authorities identified the bones as the missing hitchhikers. Since then, the area around the tree has become the scene of unexplainable encounters. Groups of people have been seen gathering beneath the tree and engaging in strange rituals. Screams have been heard by those using the hiking trails. Figures in hoods have chased several groups from the woods, but disappeared before they could be identified. A pastor was eventually asked to perform an exorcism on the tree, and a cross was placed at the base of the tree. Less than a year later, the cross was vandalized and turned upside down. In the year 2000, the area around the tree was turned into a park, and it was decided the tree had to be removed to prevent the continuation of the legend of the Devil's Tree. Work crews showed up to cut it down, but their chainsaws refused to work once their teeth touched the bark. Falling back on a non-mechanized option, they tried using a 2-handed saw, but again, once the teeth of the saw touched the tree, they fell off. The crews left and refused to return. Screaming has been heard coming from a bathroom constructed near the tree. Lights flicker and stall doors open and close on their own. People think it is the 2 young women still trapped in their most tragic moment. With a little research, this legend is quickly unraveled, but the real story is even darker. Gerard John Schaefer was a sheriff's deputy for Martin County in 1974. One night while on duty, he kidnapped 2 teenage female hitchhikers and tied them up in the woods. He threatened to sell them into prostitution or kill them. A call on his radio interrupted his torture session, and he left the girls to tend to them later. The women were able to escape and ran to the nearest police station. When Schaefer returned to his victims and found them gone, he contacted his supervisor and confessed he'd picked up some hitchhikers and tried to frighten them so they wouldn't hitchhike in the future. So he shouldn't believe any strange stories any women might be telling. Already aware of the women's side of the story, the sheriff took the deputy's badge and charged him with assault and false imprisonment. Schaefer was able to post bail, and while waiting for his trial, he abducted 2 more teenage girls. There was no interruption to save Susan Place or Georgia Jessup, and they were mercilessly tortured and killed, and their bodies buried on Hutchinson Island. Like in the legend, the women were also violated after death. Schaefer appeared in court for the abduction and false imprisonment of his 2 previous victims, and during the trial, the bodies of Susan and Georgia were discovered. The parallels between the 2 abductions prompted a search of Schaefer's home, where investigators discovered a mountain of evidence linking Schaefer to dozens of unsolved missing persons cases. Notebooks detailed his numerous crimes, describing who his victims were, how he tortured and killed them, and sometimes where their bodies were left. In one passage, he boasted of how he enjoyed the challenge of controlling and torturing 2 victims at once. He was charged and convicted of the murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup and sentenced to 2 life sentences. While in prison, he boasted of his crimes to other inmates, claiming he had more than 30 victims, but he was never formally charged with any more crimes. Gerard John Schaefer was stabbed to death by a fellow inmate in 1995. Although the stories are similar, it is obvious that the victims of Gerard Schaefer are not haunting the Devil's Tree in Port St. Lucie. That doesn't negate the validity of eerie happenings in Oak Hammock Park. It just means there are more untold stories that make up the haunting history of Florida. Thank you for listening to another story in my Spooky Florida series, bringing you a new spooky story every day in October. These stories are becoming more terrifying by the day, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming videos.